back to another exciting episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Wes Bryan, and in today's episode, we're continuing through our series within VMware. Coming back at you with some more VMware Certified Professional, and we're talking virtual machines today. But I'm not going to steal his thunder. Joining us in the studios today is none other than Mr. Don Pezet. Don, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Wes. I know it's hard to not get excited because we were counting episodes before this and talking about how we're 16, 17 episodes, however many into this series. And technically, we haven't addressed creating virtual machines yet, and it's kind of a funny topic because if you go and look at the exam objectives from VMware, creating a virtual machine is actually not on the exam objective. We could teach this whole series of topics and never actually talk about creating VMs. It does kind of defeat the purpose, though. So we are going to talk about it right here, how we create virtual machines, what the different settings mean, what's involved in that process, because ultimately, when you get vSphere all set up, the virtual machines are what's important. That's what you're going to be working with the most, and so that's what we're going to see right here in this episode. All right, now understand that in our previous episodes, we covered things like storage and networking and getting the host installed and getting vCenter installed, and that's all infrastructure, and it's really important. It's important you have your infrastructure in place and you have it configured right, because otherwise your VMs are going to run slow or inconsistently and you're going to have problems moving forward. So always keep that in mind. It's not that we've been lollygagging on wasteful topics. That's all critical stuff that's required to support your VMs. All right, but once your infrastructure is in place, working with VMs is actually really easy. So let's just dive right in. Let's dive into creating a virtual machine, and we'll just kind of walk through all the steps that are involved. I'm going to jump here into my vCenter screen, and under vCenter, way over here on the left side, all this time I keep going to host and clusters, right? Because when we go to that one, you see your vCenter servers, you see your host, you can create stuff there, you can create your data centers, your data stores. Even though data stores are under storage also, you can still create them from up here. So that's where you spend most of your time when you're supporting the infrastructure. But when you're supporting virtual machines, well, those can be done right here, VMs and templates, all right? When we go into VMs and templates, we'll see all the virtual machines you have. You cannot create a virtual machine unless you have at least one data center. You need to have a data center in place. And we talked about that earlier. If you don't have one, you just right-click on your vCenter server and you create a new data center. Not a big deal, right? Once you have the data center in place, now you can start creating VMs. You'll put your hosts in those data centers too. So I've already got one virtual machine sitting here, Web01, and it's got that little green triangle on it that lets me know it's powered on, it's running, and it's doing stuff. But I want to create my own virtual machine, a new one. And so to do that, you can actually start way up at the top if you want, or on the data center. It doesn't really matter. What we're going to do is we're going to right-click, and we're going to go to New Virtual Machine. Now, when you go to create a new virtual machine, there's two different places it can come from. From nothing, right, a new virtual machine created from scratch, or a new VM from library, all right? What's a library? Well, a library is where we store our templates. I might want to create a web server, but I've created web servers before. So I might have created a web server template that I can just clone to create this virtual machine. So I'm not creating it from scratch, I'm creating it from the library. But since this is really the beginning of this server, I don't have any of those templates. So instead, I'm going to choose the top option to create a new virtual machine. All right. And when I choose that, now I'm going to launch into the new virtual machine wizard, which is going to walk me through each of the questions that I have to answer. And you'll see there's quite a few over here. Technically, it's 3 steps. Select the type, edit the settings, finish, right? But inside of it, you'll see, especially edit the settings, there's a ton of different things that we have to provide. And depending on the answers, I may see some of those disappear, or I may see more appear as we go through the configuration. The first screen is just asking me what type of VM I want to create. Normally, we're creating a new virtual machine. That's what I'm going to do here. I could deploy from a template. I've already got a template created. I just want to clone that, right, like from the library. We could clone an existing VM. I've already got Web01. If I'm trying to make Web02, I could just clone that. And now I've got Web02, right? So I don't necessarily have to start from scratch. I could clone a virtual machine to a template. I don't have any templates right now. So I could take Web01 and clone it to turn it into a template. And now I could deploy that template as many times as I want. I could clone a template to a template. Now, that one sounds crazy. Why the heck would I want to make a template out of a template? I might want to change one. I might have one that's a web server for internal use and one that's a web server for external use. They might be identical as far as operating system, as far as the web server configuration, but they might have different firewall settings. And so I create 2 different templates. But I clone one and then modify the other template as needed. Then we've got convert template to a virtual machine. normally what we do is we deploy from template. We take a template and we copy it to make a virtual machine. If I convert a template to a virtual machine, why would I do that? Well, you can't power on a template. I can't turn a template on. And so if I want to make changes inside of it, what can I do? If I'm just changing out files, I can mount the virtual hard drive and then I can change the files. But if I want to make an operating system change, I need to boot it up. So I convert the template to a VM, I power it on, I make my changes, and when I'm done, I then clone that VM back into a template. And now it's back into the template form again. So that's all part of that template creating process. But for us, I just want to create a new virtual machine from scratch, right? So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to hit next. Now I give it a name, and I tell it where it's going to be hosted. So maybe this is going to be this will be a database server. So I'm going to call this DB01. I've got Web01. That's my web server. Here's database DB01. I'll create that. All right, and I pick the data center it wants to go into. If you expand that out, notice I don't see any hosts. I don't get to pick a host on the screen. I'm just picking a data center. You may have more than one data center, and that's going to filter the host that I see later. All right, then now it asks what host I want it to reside on. I see the data center that I picked and every host inside of it. My host 02 is in maintenance mode right now, so I'm going to choose host 01. It's kind of my only choice. It is going to run a compatibility check and make sure that I don't have any special settings that are going to conflict. Since I'm doing a new VM from scratch, that's always going to pass. But if I was doing a template, the template might call for certain hardware that's not present on that host, and then we're going to get a conflict, and we'll see a compatibility problem. That's not going to be an issue for me here. All right, now I need to pick my storage. When you create a virtual machine, it's going to have at least one virtual hard drive, and it's got to store it somewhere. But it's also going to have its configuration file, the file that identifies what hardware and other settings it has. It's got to store that somewhere too. So I've got to pick a data store for it to reside on. I'm going to put it on my direct attached one. If you haven't seen it already, watch our data store episode and we talk all about those. But this is just storage where we're going to place that virtual machine. And then we'll hit next. And now it's going to ask about compatibility. Now this is an interesting one. By default, it wants it to be compatible with ESXi 6.0 or later. All right. I might have a mixed environment where I still have ESXi 5.5 or even ESXi 5 or 5.1, maybe even 4 or 4.1. Hopefully not, but maybe, right? If I create a virtual machine that only runs on 6.0 and later, I will not be able to fail it over to my other hosts, okay? So if I have all ESXi 6 hosts, this is great, it works fine. But if I have a mixed environment, I need to pick the lowest common denominator. And VMware, with each version, they add new features. So if I drop this down, you'll see where I can pick between each of the different versions, 3.5, 4, 5, 5.1, 5.5, and 6. I need to pick the oldest version that I'm still supporting in my data center. Now, I might lose some functionality as a result. There might be something new that was in 6 that wasn't in 5.5 that I need to pick, right? Now, what these are actually matching up with, it doesn't show them here, but what these are actually matching up with are what are called hardware versions. And the hardware versions dictate what model of network adapter we simulate and how the processors are presented and so on. And a lot of it doesn't change from version to version. But if even one little thing changes, VMware increments that hardware version. The latest version number right now is version 12. So version 12 is only supported in VMware Workstation and VMware Fusion. It's not supported in VMware Server yet. It will be in the next version, but for right now it isn't. So they normally test new hardware versions in the Workstation products and then bring them into server. So we can do up to hardware version 11 right now on the server in ESX, not 12. And when we start choosing older ones, like 5.5 is hardware version 10, 5.1 is hardware version 9, and it just goes back and back and back to these different hardware versions. So that's really what we're picking. And there's a little information bubble over here you can click on, and it's got a neat little link here for more information. And it'll take you to VMware's site, and it details the differences between the hardware versions. So what is the difference if I pick hardware version 11 versus hardware version 10? Maybe I have a mixed environment. I've got 10 ESXi 6 hosts, and I've got 2 ESX 5.5 hosts, okay? Do I really care if I can fail over to those 5.5s? I still have 10 6 hosts, so I can just stick with those. Well, here's the difference, maximum memory. If I want 4 gigs of memory in that virtual machine, I need hardware version 11. in ESXi 5.5, I'm sorry, not 4 gigs, 4 terabytes. Sorry, it's a little bit bigger. If I want just 1 terabyte of memory, I can do that with ESX 5.5, right? 1 terabyte's a lot of memory though, so maybe I'm fine with that. Maximum number of processors, 128 in version 11, only 64 in version 10. Same thing with some of the other settings. A lot of it's the same. The number of SCSI adapters, the bus logic, SATA controllers, these are all identical. But you see where it gets different, like SATA controllers were not supported in version 9 and earlier. So if I want to use SATA controllers, I don't want version 9 and earlier. I want to stick it with my newer systems. So this is a neat table. You don't have to memorize it for the exam or anything, but for your own benefit, if you want to know the differences, these are the differences between it. And the way I got to that was just right here in my web client. You click the I and then more information. It'll take you right to that page and you can see everything you need. All right, so I'm going to do ESXi 6. Now, let's say that I picked 5. I can do that, and we can always upgrade it later. All right. We saw the main difference between 5.5 and 6 was simply the amount of memory. That was really the big difference in the number of processors. So if I don't care about those, I could create an ESX 5.5 compatible one at hardware version 10, and I can upgrade it after the fact. Let's do that. On the next page, I need to tell it what guest operating system I'm going to run, and this is important. I know a lot of people say, well, it's just hardware. What do we care what operating system it's going to be? We can pick whatever. But VMware actually has certain expectations for how the guest operating system is going to interact with the hardware. And depending on what you choose here, it's going to set it up for success or failure. There's some operating systems that are super picky, and there's some that are really flexible. Like with Windows, it's hard to go wrong. With Windows, you just have to pick 64-bit or 32-bit. And after that, they pretty much all work the same. A lot of the Linux distros are the same too. But there are some that are different, especially the ones that require EFI BIOS versus the ones that require traditional BIOS. That's a big difference in simulation. Also, whether they're 32-bit or 64-bit. That's important too, and we can't change it after the fact, so we've got to make sure we get it right here. So if I'm going to install Windows, I can pick that, and I can tell it the version, and you'll see 64-bit and 32-bit are called out, and we can specify all the way back to MS-DOS and Windows 3.1 if we really want to go crazy. Those are 16-bit systems if we really want to go nuts, right? But if I want to bring up a Windows Server 2012 machine, I can choose that and off we go. Or I can tell it I'm doing Linux. And under Linux, it'll throw the different distros. And this is important because there's different VMware tools that interact with these. And we'll talk about VMware tools here in a little bit. But we need to pick the right distro. And you'll see differences here by version. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 versus Red Hat Enterprise Linux version 7. Why does it have to call each one out? Well, there's big changes. Like in version 6 of Red Hat, you had the Upstart boot management process. In 7, you have systemd. Big difference, huge difference in the way they start up and the way that VMware interacts with those machines. We've got to make sure that we choose it accurately. All right, and then you'll see SUSE Linux. We've got CentOS, Debian, Asionux, I'm not familiar with that one. Oracle Linux, which is effectively CentOS, which in turn is effectively Red Hat. Ubuntu Linux, or Ubuntu Linux, if you say it right. And then we've got the generic ones. And on the generic ones, what you're picking is the version of the Linux kernel that you're running. 2.4, 2.6, or 3.x. I think it's 4.2 is what we're up to now on the latest kernel. So you would choose 3.x or later for that one.
So Don, we might be inclined to say, okay, that's just hardware, but underneath VMware, it says, okay, I recognize the DNA of that operating system, and I am expecting this to happen this way, maybe something else to happen, and then the bootloaders themselves too.
Yeah, the two main areas where we see it, and we don't actually see it, it's all behind the scenes, is that a Type 1 hypervisor acts like a traffic cop. And it says, this virtual machine is allowed to access the hardware now. Okay, you stop. Now there's other virtual machines allowed to access it. Now you stop, right? When it says stop, I need you to stop. If we choose the right OS here, it tells it nicely, hey, you need to stop. And the guest operating system understands, says, hey, it's not my turn, let me wait, okay? If we choose the wrong one here, what happens is the hypervisor says, you need to stop, and it stops it. And the guest OS doesn't know what's happening. All of a sudden, the hardware just isn't available. On some systems, they just slow down. On other systems, they blue screen or crash or throw up some error. You know, you get the SADMAC or whatever it is that your operating system does when it crashes, and that's not good, right? So it's the difference between having a stable, reliable machine or one that occasionally flakes out on you because it doesn't know what's happening. That's the main one. And the other one is memory handling, right? They're accessing RAM, and the RAM is protected space. So VMware, the hypervisor, has to protect the sections of RAM from one VM from another, And if one VM tries to do something it shouldn't, if we choose right here, it'll be nice. It'll say, these are your boundaries, you need to operate within them, and the VM will say, okay, those are my boundaries, I understand. Versus, stop blocking me, I'm going to access that memory, and then we get a segment fault or a buffer overflow or whatever, and the VM crashes, right? So it's really all about stability. You want to choose the right one. All right, so the other option is instead of Linux, we can choose other. And other's kind of a funny one because you'll see a few different options in here like Apple, Mac OS X. Now, Apple has some interesting requirements about virtualization. You're only allowed to virtualize OS X if you're running on Mac hardware. I am running on Mac hardware, and so that's why I see it. You may not see this option when yours turns up. If you're running on a regular PC, you're technically not allowed to do it. And if you keep scrolling down, you'll see FreeBSD, IBM OS 2. Talk about particular. This one is super sensitive about memory. If you don't choose this option, you are not getting OS 2 running. Good old Novell NetWare, if we want to walk down memory lane. We got Solaris, even Solaris back to the Sun Microsystem days. SCO Open Server, which I don't think anybody runs anymore, but you never know. Serenity Systems Ecom Station, that's the new version of OS 2. Well, I call it new. They haven't really done much with it. Then you've got generic systems here and ESXi. You can actually run ESXi as a virtual machine on top of ESX, which it certainly works. Actually, I'm kind of doing it right now. So you can do it. It doesn't run very fast. So it's great for labs and learning. It's not great for production.
I think it's kind of interesting there, Don, if you were to tell somebody, okay, so how did you have that set up as far as your guest OS family? You had the other.
The other. So let's see. I'm going to do a Debian 7. And it's not a bad thing to choose other, right? There are times where you just have to say, look, go generic, and we'll hope for the best with my VM, right? And that's what you have to choose. So you don't want to choose like a wrong operating system. All right, but I'm going to bring up a Debian machine. I want to bring up a MySQL database, and so I'm going to use Debian Linux to do it. And so I've got the 64-bit version of Debian Linux 7. I think I've actually like 7.4 or 7.5. So I'm going to install that one. And now when I hit next, it's going to ask me to customize the hardware. And this is kind of the important screen because what I pick here is going to dictate how well my virtual machine performs. Now on a nice side, I can change all this after the fact. So it's hard to screw up this screen. That screen a moment ago where I picked my operating system, I can screw things up there. Here, if I screw it up, I can always just come back and edit it and fix it, right? So it's not the end of the world. The first choice I have are my CPUs. And the main thing it's asking me is just how many CPUs do I want? Do I want 1, 2, 20? Right? And it's going to show based on how many your physical machine has. My machine has 2. I can't choose more than 2. I can't choose more than what I have, right? So it's holding me to 2. It's going to have 1 CPU by default. I can bump that up if I want. If you click the little I here, it just gives you a little more information here, warning you about not going crazy with virtual CPUs because you can oversubscribe your system. You can get your system too busy. All right? So I might want to bump this one up to 2 or leave it at 1. If I had 4 CPUs or 8 CPUs, they would all show up here, and I'd be able to pick that. On the memory side, same thing. We can choose the amount of RAM that we want to have, and you've got the pre-selected options here. If we drop it down, this is based on the operating system we picked on the last screen. So it's telling me a minimum of 512, a maximum of 1 terabyte, right, because of the hardware version I chose. If I had chosen hardware version 11, I could go up to 4 terabytes. But since I chose hardware version 10, I'm limited to 1 terabyte. It's telling me best for performance is 4. I can punch in whatever value I want. I'm going to go with a minimum. Right? And you can always change to larger units of measure to make it easier to type in that number. Now notice on the left side there's a little drop-down box by these, and if you click it, each of these actually have additional options. So for example, my virtual CPUs, I can do virtual cores inside of them too, if my physical hardware supports it. We can turn on CPU hot plug, which not many systems support, adding CPUs while the system is on. We can also reserve performance. We can set minimum amounts of resources and maximum amount of resources that are available for that VM to stop one VM from monopolizing our entire system and causing the other VMs to start slowing down. You can do a CPU ID mask. Now, this is important. Normally, Type 1 and even some Type 2 hypervisors can't run in a virtual machine. You can't nest virtualization products. But if you expose these flags to the guest, you actually can. Some of this stuff can start to work. Now, it's not a good idea. In a lab environment, you may use that. In production, you probably won't, so you can turn that off. Same thing with the hardware virtualization. We can turn that on and expose it to the VM. And then some of the other options that you'll see kind of laid out here. Most of these we typically won't mess with. They're in specific scenarios where we're wanting to tune performance that we can adjust them. On the RAM side, you'll see where we can reserve memory. Now, why would we reserve memory? I gave it 2 gigs, it's going to have 2 gigs of memory, right? Well, you can actually assign more memory to your VMs than you actually have. And the VMs all start to share memory. The problem is if all your VMs request memory at once, you can get contention and people don't get access to the memory they want. So we can set up reservations. We can lock that guest memory and say that it will be available to this machine, or a certain amount will be available. And you can set upper limits and lower limits for that. All right, so you do have a couple of different options there. On the hard drive side, it's going to have one hard drive by default. I might want more, and I can certainly add more, but the default is to have one. It's going to do a 16 gig drive. I might want more, I might want less. VMware is basing this on the recommendations from that vendor when we picked it from the drop-down box on the last screen. So I can just bump that number up. We can go megabytes, terabytes, whatever it is that we want to create. All right. If you expand that out, you'll see there's a handful of options here as far as like which data store it's going to be, and you'll see the location by default to store it with the VM, so we'll see that on another screen in a moment. Or actually, I think we already picked the data store, didn't we? Yeah, I put it in the direct attached storage, so we've already picked that. You can set up whether it's shared storage, if you're going to limit I/O, this is part of the storage I/O control, we can start to define those options, and if it's got any virtual flash read cache, accelerated storage. On a database server like this, I might want that. That would improve performance. On a web server, I probably wouldn't bother. On a database server, it's different. All right, SCSI controller, right? We have a SCSI controller here, which is a VMware Paravirtual controller. Normally, we don't emulate hardware so that we can access it at wire speed, but the emulated SCSI controller that creates is paravirtualized. In other words, you sort of see the hardware, but you're not allowed to directly talk to it. You have to go through the hypervisor. But we're going to format our calls in a way that's already ready to be sent to that hardware controller and get improved performance. That's the default. We don't want to mess with that. But you can change it and say, I don't want to do VMware Paravirtual. I want to do one of these other ones, like LSI Logic or Bus Logic. Just know if you choose those, the call you're making is not in the right format. Now it's got to be changed, and you're going to get lower performance. When would I want to do this? If I had some guest operating system that didn't support the VMware drivers, then I could choose one of these, and the guest operating system might choose it. So I would only use this if it was the difference between the virtual machine working or not working. I wouldn't use this if I could get the virtual machine working under the Paravirtual driver. That's typically what you want. All right, networking. Which network do I want to plug it into? And I'll drop that down and see the various networks that we've created. These would be your vSwitches, distributed virtual switches, and the port groups that are on them. So I've got a port group called VM Network, and that's what I'm seeing. That's the only port group I've got right now. Notice the connect option. If that's not checked, when the system boots up, it'll see a network adapter, but it'll look like the cable's unplugged. If it's checked, we'll have a link light, the cable's plugged in. Normally you want that, but maybe you've got some problem with the virtual machine, or maybe you're testing a restore of a machine, and when you boot it up, you don't want to get duplicate IPs on the network because the real machine is still running. So we might choose to boot it with that not connected. That way we can boot it up and test the machine and make sure it's not working. Normally I'd just move it off to a different port group, and that would stop the duplicate IPs too. CD drive. We usually only need the CD drive for doing the install of the guest OS, right? I told it that I was going to install Debian Linux on this. Where's it going to get Debian Linux from? I need to give it to it. And so I can plug that into the CD. The default is that it's going to plug into the client device, and that means on my ESXi host, there's a physical CD drive, and I'm going to put the disk in there. But I have a data store ISO. So I've got an ISO image of Debian Linux. It's in one of my data stores, and I can come in here and find it. If I go to my data store and I find Debian, there it is. And so now I can pop that in. Now be careful here because notice the default is that it's not connected. Can't boot off a CD unless it's connected. I need to check that to say when it boots up, have that CD in the drive ready to do the install. Floppy drive. Well, to be honest with you, most of us don't need floppy drives anymore, but maybe you've got some system like, maybe you're trying to do that Windows 3.1 install. That was on a floppy disk, and so you do your virtual floppy disks to get that set up, and so you could come in and connect that. Honestly, I don't need it, so I'd probably come back and delete this floppy drive later. Pretty sure we can't delete that from here, or actually we can. If we look, when I float over that floppy drive, way on the right side here, my little X appears, and I can click that, and I just got rid of the floppy drive. If you don't need hardware, get rid of it, because that's extra drivers and stuff the virtual machine doesn't need. So I'm just going to delete that floppy drive. Same thing goes for things like sound cards. If you're not going to use sound on your server, you get rid of the sound card. And I'm pretty sure I don't have a sound card on this one anyway. But those are just examples of hardware that you may or may not need. Technically, once the OS is installed, I don't need that CD drive anymore. So I might choose to come back and delete the CD drive just to get it out of the way. Video card. For most of us, the regular video card is fine. But if you're running the latest hardware version, if you're doing hardware version 11, it supports up to 2 gigs of video memory. That means you can do 3D rendering, 3D accelerated video, and maybe you want that, or high resolution screens. If I'm doing a command line based web server or database server, I don't need that. So I can choose a video card that has a very low level of settings, right? 1 display, 8 megabytes of memory, and that's it. Okay, no 3D support. But if I'm trying to run some 3D accelerated whatever, you usually see this with virtual desktop. If you're doing VDI, somebody wants to run their Windows desktop from the server and they want it to look pretty. So for them, we might need to bump them up to more displays, or they might need a gig of memory or whatever, and I don't have enough in my server to be able to do that, so we'll say 512, right? And if you do enough, you can actually enable that 3D support. I don't have a 3D card in my hardware server, so if I did, I could choose that, and then we'd have that 3D support, all right? But the reality is most of us don't need that, and so I'm gonna leave that at the basic settings here, nothing too fancy. We'll just leave it be. If you do the auto detect, it looks at your server's hardware and it tries to match that for the guest. But again, we don't normally sweat that. All right, then we got VMCI, and that's our communication interface. This is how VMware talks to virtual machines, but notice right here, obsolete. VMCI between VMs is no longer supported. All right, and what happens now is virtual machines are not allowed to talk directly to each other. Instead, they talk via the network, and that way we control them just like any other machines. It's part of the virtual machine isolation. If I had chosen an older hardware set, I could have picked this option, but it's not supported on mine. And honestly, you don't really need it anymore. And then lastly, we have other devices, which are kind of miscellaneous stuff, right? Like IDE, keyboard, mouse, and so on. These are things that we don't typically need to mess with, and that's a good thing because there's no real options to mess with them. If you need some hardware that didn't show up, I'm creating a database server. So I want one hard drive for the operating system. I want another hard drive for my database. Well, it's only going to create one hard drive, right? Well, down here we can create additional hardware, and I want to add another hard drive. So when I click that, I'll see a list of all the things that we can add. And most of it's pretty straightforward, right? New hard drive, network, CD, DVD, serial ports, and so on. Some of them are a little weird though, like USB controller or host USB device. I can actually take a USB device plugged into the host and attach it to a virtual machine. They call it USB pass-through. Not every hardware supports that, but sometimes you might have software that requires like a USB dongle for its license, and I can plug it in and do that. The risk is that you can't use vMotion anymore, because the USB device is plugged into one host, your virtual machine is now married to that host. If your virtual machine fails to another host, it doesn't have the USB dongle over there, it's not going to work, right? So that kills mobility, but the functionality is there. SCSI and PCI devices are in there. What's one that is a little more commonly used? RDM disk. That's a raw device disk, right? This is where I have a raw hard drive exposed to the VM. If I want the best possible disk I/O, I can take a raw disk and attach it to my database server here. No other virtual machine can touch that disk. It's now exclusive to this virtual machine. And once it's tied to the VM, it now has exclusive access, so it doesn't have to go through a filter. It can just reach out and touch that disk and get the best disk I/O possible, right? So I can add that here, but I just want a regular disk for me. So I'm going to create a new one, and it's just a new hard disk. I'll add that in, and now I can pick the size. Maybe I want this one to be 500 gigs, right? Oh, apparently I don't have enough room for that. What room do I have? Is it not going to tell me? All right, we'll just do 100 gigs then. So I'll create a 100 gig disk, and I'll punch that one in, and now I'll have a place to put my database. And I could add more disks or more network adapters or whatever else I needed.
Now, Don, was that over allocation? Is that what it showed you right away? It said, well, you're trying 500 gigs, but we're not going to give it to you because we don't have it.
You know, I didn't pay attention when the error popped up. So, and now it's now it's not going to tell me. But more than likely, I don't remember how much storage I actually have. Oh, I have a second hard drive in this thing, and it is only 500 gigs, so I must have picked a bigger number. And there we go. Yep, that warning popped up, and it said it was greater than the amount available in the data store, so I'm exceeding it. Now, that doesn't mean I can't do it, right? And that's why I expanded this. So according to this, I can't make it. I want a terabyte. I'm going to do a terabyte disk. Well, it's not going to let me, right? I could thin provision the disk. All right, now, if I expand this out, I'll see the options in the disk, and right now it's going to create it in the data store. And if I look right down here, I've got disk provisioning, and right now it's thick provision lazy 0. I've got thick provision eager 0 and thin provision. What are these? Well, thick provision lazy 0, what that means is if I tell it I want a terabyte, it's going to lay out 1 terabyte of storage right now. It's going to flag 1 terabyte just for this virtual machine, reserved, exclusive, right now, okay? And that's all it's going to do. It's just going to flag it for us. Thick Provision Eager 0 does the same thing, except it then proceeds to write a 0 to every block inside of that terabyte. So what if that storage was used somewhere else before? There might be deleted files that are in the background. So I fire up a VM, and then I run a scan on it. And I scan the hard drive, and I can find deleted files, maybe from another customer, right? So if I have multiple tenants, if I'm renting out storage space to people, I want to make sure that data gets zeroed out so they can't find somebody else's data. So that's the difference between these two. But both of them provision the data immediately. If I want to give it a terabyte, I need a terabyte of storage. Or I could lie to the server and tell it to thin provision. With thin provision, it says, I want a terabyte, but create an empty file. Create a file that's very small. And as I put data in it, then grow the disk to get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? On one hand, it lets me have really big disks, even though I don't have the storage to back it, knowing that in the future I can always move to bigger disks when that time comes. On the other hand, every time that file has to grow, it starts to fragment, and I get a performance decrease. Thin provisioning is great in labs and research environments because you can create huge amounts of storage in a small amount of space, but the performance of it is terrible in production. So we don't normally want that in production. All right, but it does allow us to cheat the system. And so now, when I choose to thin provision that disk, it'll actually be okay with me provisioning out something bigger because it's going to be thin provisioned. All right, but I'm not going to do that. I'll do the thick provision lazy 0, and I'll just do 100 gigs. I'll try and be nice to my system. And oh, it's telling me my maximum right there. I guess if I had bothered to look at that, that would have told me. All right, so I'm going to set that and get that disk added in. And now, when I hit next, it's got everything it needs to create my virtual machine. Actually, let me go back one screen. I stopped right there. There are a few more options in here. If I go to the VM options button, you'll see where we can do the advanced settings in here. And I want to cover these, but I know we're out of time, Wes. It was giving me the evil eye. So we'll talk more about these settings in the next episode. And the distributed resource scheduler, which I know we've mentioned in other episodes too, we'll talk about a little more too. So there are a few more options there. But as far as creating the VM, that's enough for me to move forward and finish it. And once it's finished, it creates the VM, but it's powered off and it's just sitting there. I need to start it up so that it can start its install and install the guest operating system and begin to work with it. But as far as creating the VM, those are all my settings, it's all in place, and I'm ready to get it fired up.
It's great to see that with all this talk about virtualization in VMware, that VMware actually virtualizes virtual machines. So good to see that. Does look like we're running to the end of another episode, and I know we're coming back from a part 2. But before we do, Don, got any additional words?
The main thing is most of the options that you choose during VM creation, you can change later. So it's hard to make a mistake that you can't fix. The one exception is when you pick the operating system. If you pick that wrong, it's easier to just delete the VM and create a new one than it is to try and fix that. It's not an easy thing to fix. So make sure you choose that correctly. I didn't get to upgrading. Shoot, I wanted to show upgrading because remember I created hardware level 10. I wanted to bump it up to hardware 11. It's actually super easy to do that. So we'll do that in part 2. I'll need to make a note to remember that. But there is more to see. Just remember, most of the changes you can correct later on. So if you make a mistake, it's not a big deal.
Well, Don, we look forward to seeing you in part 2. Thanks for being in the studio as always. And thank you to our viewers for watching. Signing out for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Wes Bryan.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.